All right, so here in our counter component, this is where we have the increment button. First, I'm going to change this label to a plus sign, and then I'm going to duplicate this and change the plus to minus. Now here in the onClick expression, we need to raise a different event that is on decrement. So we need to go to our counters component and pass on decrement via props. So let's go here. This is counters component. We're passing on increment. We should also pass on decrement. Now, as I told you before, this component itself does not handle events. It simply bubbles them up to its parent, which is the app component. So here we simply pass a reference to this.props.on decrement. And finally, we go to app component. Here we have handle increment. Handle decrement is pretty similar, so I'm going to duplicate this and then rename it to handle decrement. Now, instead of increasing the value, we're going to decrease it. And finally, we need to go to our render method. So this is where we're passing handle increment. We need to pass handle decrement as well. This.handle decrement. So conceptually, our counters component is raising an event called onDecrement, and our app component is handling that event using this event handler. This is the actual concept. The implementation in React is using props to pass function references. Okay, now let's test the application up to this point. So here, don't worry about the ugly layout. Let's just make sure this new button works. Click, click, beautiful. Now let's clean up the layout. So we go to our counter component. I'm going to apply a class to this div. So class name, we set this to row. In case you haven't seen this class before, this is one of the Bootstrap classes for implementing grid layouts. The explanation of that is beyond the scope of this course, and that's something you need to learn by looking at the Bootstrap documentation. So in this row, we're going to have two columns. I'm going to add two divs. The first div with the class call-1, that's a small column. And next to that, I'm going to add another div with the class call, which takes the rest of the page. So tab, now we have two divs. In the first div with call1, I'm going to put our span, our badge. And in the second div, which takes the rest of the space, I'm going to add our buttons. So let's grab all these buttons, cut them, and put them right here. Now, back in the browser, you can see our buttons are lined up, beautiful. We just need a bit of margin between these two buttons. So here's our decrement button. I'm going to add another class here, m-2, save the changes, back in the browser, that looks better. With this, we no longer need to apply margin on the delete button because as you can see, there is a bit of extra space here. So back in the code, here's our delete button. I'm going to delete the m2 class here. So we'll only have m2 on the decrement button, and this will add a margin to the left and to the right side of this button. Save the changes, one final look, beautiful. Now the last thing we need to implement is to make sure that if the value is 0, this button is disabled. So here's our decrement button. We want to apply an attribute dynamically. So if I apply disabled here, this button will always be disabled. Now I want to apply this attribute dynamically based on a condition. So back in the code, we set this to an expression. If this.props.counter.value equals 0, we're going to set this to the text disabled. Otherwise, we're going to set this to an empty string. Now you can see if the value of the counter is 0, the decrement button is disabled. Let's increment this. Now it's enabled. Let's decrement it. Now it's disabled. Beautiful.